Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to hear that everybody's already in party mode. We obviously can't wait to get rid of this guy here. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon to Peat's farewell seminar and drinks afterwards. I'd just like to say a few introductory words because I'm the one who's largely responsible that Peat ended up working TIA for the last few years. I just want to give you a little bit of a background to that, because when I arrived here in 2011, I was really excited about the new opportunity and started using words like TIA is a boundary organisation, and we work in sort of partnerships right across those various domains. And I largely got blank looks from people. And at some stage, we went out for a beer, and Peat was part of that group. And he was one of the few people who didn't give me blank looks about it. And he said, "Oh, that's exciting." And then he started telling me all of the work that he was doing here. We have met previously, briefly. And that started a discussion about what we actually need to underpin some of the core business that an organisation like TIA is doing, where we're working in partnership with society, with government, with the university, with students. And what became clear is that what was missing is sort of that component science for society interface. And Peat got really excited about it, so we managed to scramble a few dollars together, and Peat started leading that sort of program. And I have to say, he led that very competently and very calmly, but also with a profound impact. I can say that after the few years that Peat has been working with us, he actually is leaving the organisation that has changed profoundly, partly because of the contribution that he has made to it. And I think that will come through in your presentation this afternoon, Peat, where you will be talking about some of your experiences, but more broadly about science, sustainability and impact, and hopefully also give us a bit of advice about what we need to move forward. So very much looking forward to your seminar this afternoon, Peat, and looking forward even more so to the drinks afterwards. And hopefully at some stage we might be able to welcome you back to Tasmania. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Holger. And it's been a very great pleasure working here, and I've learnt so much from so many different people in so many different aspects of what I'm doing. So this talk is a bit of a culmination of lots of things that I've learnt wrapped up in a quick snapshot. And I can't acknowledge everyone here. I've been in this university and in what is now this school, first of all in geography and now in TIA for a very long time, longer than I can tell you. Although some of you will remember when I first arrived, and it's really exciting to be moving on, but it's mixed feelings as well, deeply. But this work is largely the summation of work that I've been doing with Marcus Howard and Emily Ogier and Brian Coffey and Kevin O'Toole from Victoria, from the Coastal Collaboration Cluster, but it's permeated all sorts of other aspects of what I do, and it has precedence in work that I've done with Rowan and Holger and Andrew and many other people here, including Kathy. You'll see traces of the MER project coming through this. So what I'm presenting today is a bit of a build-on from this paper, and it's in many ways a thumbnail sketch of a book that will be coming out next year, a practitioner's handbook under CSIRO Publishing that we're currently trying to put together. So this is a work in progress. Before I get into talking about science, society, science, sustainability and impact, I want to define my terms in an interim sort of a way a lot of these concepts are used and bandied about in all sorts of ways, and we use them willy-nilly within the university, and we often don't really think about what they mean. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. Obviously, sustainability is a contested term that's been debated for years by sociologists and scientists and all sorts. So is science. No one really agrees what it is, but for the purposes here, I'm referring to it as systematic approaches to developing new knowledge and technologies. So I'm including myself as a qualitative social researcher in this category, and many practitioners as well also have systematic ways of developing knowledge. Sustainability, I'm going back to the roots of the Brundtland report. This is actually from the definition of sustainable development, but this idea of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs puts an onus on us to think not only about the distribution of goods and bads today, but into the future, and to be responsible for those future generations. This is something that we often don't think about in agriculture, where we're thinking about the needs and the tensions that currently exist in a political time frame. But this stuff is enshrined in our legislation. It is public values that need to be embodied in our practice. Impact is another term that's been bandied about an awful lot lately. And I'm talking about this as the sum of all our research outcomes. We produce a lot of outputs that lead to no outcomes. We produce some outputs that have extraordinary impact in the world. As time goes by, there's an increasing onus on universities to account for the outcomes of the public funding that goes into it in societal, environmental, economic terms. And we're part of that shift in TIA. We've got an MER project which is about not only measuring and monitoring the impacts of our research, but as Dan Sarowitz said when he came and visited us a few years ago, governing those outcomes. So thinking about how we might do that, and that's really what this talk is about, how we govern outcomes. When I'm talking about the social, I'm not just talking about the relationships between you and me. I'm using these slides here so that you don't all look at me all the time. It's a social device. Objects are social as well, depending on how we use them, and it's our interactions with these components that are key to the social fabric. And finally, institutions are not the organisations in which we work. They're the norms and rules that govern behaviour. So they may be formal or informal, and they're our actions that control and influence how each of us works. So definitions are out of the way. I want to tell a quick story. This won't do these protocols justice at all, and much of this talk could be spread out over days or weeks, really. But the Montreal and Kyoto protocols are very interesting stories because they represent two moments in history, one of great hope and one of tragedy, really. Although they look quite the same, one was about reducing the CFCs going into the atmosphere, which obviously were causing ozone depletion and thereby increasing rates of sunburn and skin cancer, a very direct corporeal threat to human beings. Humans were therefore quite concerned about this issue. But corporations also saw an opportunity here to develop new markets and new products. The same can't be said of the Kyoto Protocol. We didn't have an easy answer to climate change. We didn't have an easy substitute for cheap fossil fuels. But yet when people came to Kyoto in 1992, they were looking back at what happened in 1987 and thinking, oh, we can do well here. We can do this sort of work. That optimism was fairly short-lived, and the tragedy of it continues to this day. Nowhere else better explained than in the quotes of the then Presidents of the United States. From Ronald Reagan, in relation to the Montreal Protocol, I'm pleased to sign the instrument of ratification for the Montreal Protocol governing substances that deplete the ozone layer. The protocol marks an important milestone for the future quality of the global environment and the health and well-being of the peoples of all the world. So here we are, proudly standing on the brink of an opportunity to protect the environment, people's health, also a huge opportunity for business. George W. Bush's comments around the Kyoto Protocol couldn't be more dissimilar. The Kyoto Protocol would harm the US economy. The Senate's unanimous vote demonstrates that the protocol is unfair and ineffective means of addressing global climate change. What I want to talk about in this talk is that we have very different sorts of problems that we try to govern, and we have very different sorts of science that tries to influence that. I'm not for a moment telling people how to do their science, but I'm very interested in how we develop social and institutional mechanisms of linking that science with outcomes. And that needs to be different for different contexts. So these grand global pictures are a very big scale compared to the issues that we deal with, and give us some hope that we can actually deal with some of these things. All models are wrong, but some are useful. I would add to Box and Draper's suggestion that this is only the case sometimes. Some models will help us understand the world in some situations and not in others. So the widely sort of used mental model of the deficit model, that we need to produce information to increase the general public's knowledge so that then they can make better decisions and more wise decisions, seems to have applied in the Montreal case. Science produced this concern about the ozone hole and people reacted. They changed their preferences. Similarly, the linear model, in which basic research leads to applied research, development and then products, seems to work in the Montreal Protocol, but neither of them work in the case of global climate change. And in many of our problems where there is a lot at stake for people and a huge amount of uncertainty, these models simply don't hold. How might we then think about what sorts of approaches will work? Where we've settled is thinking about problems as a constellation of issues that people care about, where there's something at stake. A novel is only good when there's drama, right? When there's something at stake for the people in the plot. So if we consider a problem as a constellation of issues, what's the role of science in getting to grips with it? Well, science might be able to look at a few of these parts in great detail often. If we use interdisciplinary approaches and collaborative approaches to science, we might be able to link some of these parts. This might be a picture, say, of irrigation research in Tasmania, and we have linkages between the soil components and the water demands and the plant physiology, and these components we can link together. But some of the other components might be to do with governance. And we know that water governance around the world has often failed, but it's not necessarily linked into our systems approach of thinking about the world. Then we, for a moment, think about the same sort of a problem space as a political issue. And what politicians are often very good at is articulating the different issues in ways that resonate with people. When I say articulating, I mean it in both senses of the word. One is about the clarity with which we speak, and the other is joining things together. So an articulated vehicle moves through the joins between the parts. So a politician can create a narrative which links these issues in a coherent way and appeals to particular constituencies. They'll use the relevant science to back up that narrative and to give it credibility. And they'll join up particular constituency groups through that narrative. This is a model which Winston Churchill happily called science on tap but not on top. In today's world, where we're dealing with really difficult issues of sustainability, can science afford to be the handmaiden to politics? I would suggest not. I would suggest that our institutions themselves need to manage to build constituency support for research agendas which articulate different issues. And I'll go on to talk about how we might do that. This framework from problem structuring comes from Thompson and Tuden, 1959, a book that's in our library down here, and is really the first iteration of a bunch of work that said the two main features that structure problems and the way we might think about problems are at the levels of agreement about goals, or values divergence, it's often called, and how far we are from certainty about them. Often in agriculture, we deal with issues where we're fairly close to certain about how the system operates, and we're fairly close to agreement about the goals that we've got. It's an on-farm issue. The farm family has specific goals, and we have information which can inform that. But most sustainability issues are not those sorts of issues. They're issues where there's trade-offs and differences from different perspectives, and often a high degree of uncertainty. Now, these axes of this very simple 2x2 matrix are not independent and shouldn't be thought of as such. While we might consider scientific uncertainty as separate from the reality of the idea of signal and noise, for instance, in our own instrumental measurement of systems, uncertainty in this context is much more about the politics of decision making. So when we're far from agreement, as we see in climate change, we also have a high degree of societal uncertainty about the issues. So I'm going to use this framework for the rest of the talk to think about how we might address different sorts of problems, different categories of problems, in terms of building specific social and institutional infrastructure that links science with decision makers, with publics, with policy makers. But before doing that, I just want to talk about a few risks that we often face in this sort of space. We like order, right? We're pattern-loving creatures, and we like to try and create order where there isn't order. So there is a temptation to try and transform judgment issues into computational issues. The narrative of filling knowledge gaps is a key one. Be aware that there are many issues where there is indeterminacy and ignorance, and we cannot overcome it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to overcome it and reduce uncertainty in all cases, but in some cases we need to think about whether this is a question of political judgment rather than a question of over-analysing the problem endlessly. From the other side, it's very often tempting for politicians to try and turn issues where this context is far from agreement into those which are much closer to agreement by simplifying them and scientising them. So the risk of trying to push a problem from one of these quadrants into the easiest one to deal with is a substantial risk, and something we see all the time in various issues. The way I'd like to now fill this diagram is in relation to a variety of foci. Now, so this work comes from analysis of a variety of coastal management issues that we looked at in southeast Tasmania and in Western Victoria, where there were different processes going on, but we analysed the categories of interactions that led to outcomes into these 5 groups: an actor focus, an object focus, a relationship focus, a network focus, and an organisation focus. I'll explain what these mean, and then talk briefly about how they might work in each of the different sectors, or at least in a couple of the sectors. So an actor focus. Once again, I'm not talking about what scientists do necessarily. I'm talking about the linkages between science and practice. If people are interested in reflecting on their own practice as scientists, I really recommend looking at Roger Pielke's book. He basically uses these 4 categories: science arbiters who are removed from the policy process but answer questions when they're thrown at them; pure scientists who simply produce their reports and say, take it or leave it, I'm not concerned about your decision making; issue advocates who are passionate about one particular outcome and use their research to support movements towards that outcome; and honest brokers who essentially try to remain objective or impartial in their analysis of different policy options and different problem framings. So I'm not really talking about the role of scientists, though, today. I really want to talk about different sorts of actors. We've got a couple in the room here who I've worked with who work in natural resource management organisations and are key actors at the boundaries between science and decision making. So in an actor focus, when we're close to agreement, close to certainty, as we often are here, we want to do this thing that we call linking research, development, extension. There's technical and translational competencies involved, and people need to be able to see the needs of decision makers and clarify what they are and ensure the technical response, the technical information meets those needs. When we're less close to certainty, there's often a temptation of decision makers to jump to assumptions about how we will achieve those outcomes, and a key role is to help to challenge those assumptions and to question those assumptions for particular actors. In the top quadrant for inspiration, in the inspiration sector, and this is hard work and very skilled work. We need facilitators, mediators, and authentic leaders who can consolidate perspectives, who can articulate common ground and work with the differences among constituent groups. But they need to be able to do that in ways that are not only legitimate to those groups, but in ways that draw the technical aspects of science together and create constituency support for the scientific information. So that's an actor focus. We often think about actors as the sort of key thing in the mix here, but there's other ways of thinking about this too, and I guess where I'd like to take you next is the object focus. We often have projects which have a series of milestones along the way, the objects which come out of these projects, and at the end have a final report, a series of papers and such like. Boundary objects are different. They're objects which we use specifically to work with people to develop a sense of difference and similarity among social worlds. So boundary objects are the sort of arrangements, as I was saying before, they're the arrangements that I've got this screen so that you're distracted, that allow different groups to work together without consensus. So they allow us not to sit in a comfortable place where we all agree with each other, but we all look at the object in different ways and have different interpretations, but the object brings us together. So different groups interpret things differently. It contains specific disciplinary meaning, but different social meaning. And it can be used to develop shared meaning. So the example I've got here is work that we did with Luke Diddams. We were working with 9 natural resource management organisations across southeastern Australia, and almost all of them said, we don't want maps. Maps are dangerous. Maps are not boundary objects because they're immutable. They don't change at all. And people get on the ground get very scared that this map infers something about my place and my property. MCAS is a software tool which allows us to do participatory GIS, allows us to shift things on the run. So it requires scientific commitment to particular values, but it also enables us to use social values to overlay what those commitments are. When we're thinking about our matrix in terms of an object focus, when we're close to certainty and close to agreement, a loading dock approach where we deliver the outcome, the output to the user may work in some cases. When they're extremely technically literate, we've done a bit of work with salmon aquaculture. Most of the people who are involved in growing salmon have got PhDs. The conversations they have with scientists are way above my head, so they can deal with quite technical information. But often we need discussion support systems. This is Rowan Nelson, 1990, whatever it was, transforming the idea of decision support systems which inform a decision to an object which allows a different discussion to happen, which allows social learning to happen around a specific model or instrument. So there's fantastic work going on in CSIRO and IMAS in this space. But we often have a very clear goal. When we disagree about what we're trying to achieve and are far from certainty, there's all sorts of objects that we can use, and models are one of them, to structure dialogue, to articulate the scientific understanding with the values and concerns of stakeholders. And those models can gain increasing weight and importance in helping that discussion happen. Many of you will recall the Murray-Darling Basin report. That was not this sort of object, right? relationship focus is really largely focused on social capital. So here's two forms of liquid social capital, which we'll be imbibing together later on. I highly recommend the one on the left there. It loosens people up. So when there's animosity and tension, people can start to talk about these sorts of things which wouldn't normally be a safe space within the institutions that exist that surround their behaviour. We often, in scientific circles, tend to consider this stuff as a bit soft and fluffy, but trust is the carriage by which knowledge travels. Trust is the way you get to know. So the beginning of peer review in science, they lined up gentlemen because they had no stake in telling lies, they had no interest to tell lies or couldn't be bought off, and they watched the experiments and then reported them. They were the peers who reported, and they were the trustworthy individuals. So this idea that what is social and creates trust is unimportant, to me, is one of the biggest misnomers. But yeah, so I just want to touch on two things in relation to this: the bridging and the bonding social capital. So we have in-group connections which need to be strengthened through bonding social capital, through events that we celebrate our successes and discuss our challenges. But we also need to consider the bridges that we connect to others to ensure that we don't silo ourselves. And a key part of that is trust and reciprocity. So Ostrom and Walker's book, interdisciplinary book, basically argues that trust and reciprocity are two sides of the same coin and need to be considered as such. A really nice program where they're working this stuff up beautifully is the Centre for Science and Policy at Cambridge University. The Policy Fellows program basically invites a bunch of policy wonks from Whitehall and various local governments to come to Cambridge. What they first do, though, is they say, this is the question that I'm struggling with. And the people at CSAP essentially do a dating thing for them. So they go and talk to all the professors who have knowledge relevant to their concern, relevant to their struggle, their policy struggle. So they get to talk to all these people from different perspectives about how they think about the policy issue, whether it's health or housing or transport. And then they know those people and they can pick up the phone next time they have a challenge. So this is exactly the sort of relationship focus that we need to build around problem structuring. How that applies, now I'm just cutting down the weight of the different boxes to give you a picture here of what we reckon. In a computational sense, needs are understood iteratively through relationships. Needs aren't pre-formed. They're not something we can go and say, what do you need in terms of our science? It takes a long time. So our work with natural resource management folks, they said at the outset, we don't know what we don't know. And we need to build that capacity to understand so that we can know what we need to know. So that idea that you iteratively build knowledge through relationships and through technological change over time is a key part in all these issues. But where we require inspiration, we need really safe spaces. We need facilitators who can create a space where people feel comfortable to talk about things that they may not have been able to talk about before. Some of the work we've done, we've used interviews to separate people from their concerns and narratives so that we've been able to present the wide variety of issues back to people in an anonymous form, and they've been able to have a meta conversation around the key issues at the table without saying, you shouldn't think that, we don't do that, and getting into a fight about it. They can look at it somewhat more objectively. The next focus, which is quite closely related but a little bit different, is a network focus. And this is considering projects as interventions into a social dynamic. So the picture on the left here, it draws from the work of Anne-Marie Dowd and others in CSIRO, published in Nature Climate Change this year. And it's very pertinent to agriculture. Many of you will be aware of Roger's diffusion of innovations model. And the idea is that early adopters innovators pick things up, and then early adopters do, and then the rest do, and finally, after a very long time, the laggards are dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century and pick up iPhones and things. This is a similar picture about transformational adapters and incremental adapters, so it's in relation to climate change. And what we have is a picture of the social networks of the incremental adapters and the transformational adapters, and then on the other side, the incremental adapters and the transformational adapters information networks. So you can see that they're almost mirror images, right? Your incremental adapters have big social networks. They're institutionalized into ways of thinking and ways of being which limit their ability to innovate rapidly. And they have limited information networks. The transformational adapters tend to have really deep and wide knowledge networks, information networks. They link up with all sorts of people all around the world who are doing things differently, and they get ideas from that. We tend to work with these people. They don't have friends. Just a thought. So how do we link with networks? We need to we need to think in terms of those networks that we influence and how, and why we choose to influence those people. And we need to consider that as a legacy of the project. If we work within networks, we can look at the legacy of our work through networks. Finally, quickly, so I think this is probably pretty straightforward. I'll just add that at the top corner there, a key bit of linking networks where there's conflict and controversy is ensuring we have what Les Robinson calls the right inviters, that we have people who are respected across networks who are able to invite people into a conversation that they might not have had before, into a project that they might not really be that interested in, but because someone who they trust is inviting them, they can be brought into that project and start to think about things a bit differently. We're very much dealing with coalitions and factions as networks, and they tend to be very siloed, very little bridging social capital and very strong bonding social capital. Finally, Holger mentioned TIA was a boundary organisation, and an organisation focus is really for those long-lasting problems which don't go away after a project or two. This focus is about the structures and the rules and the accountability that we build into the organisations that we work in. And the boundary organisation literature, starting off with Dave Gustin from Arizona State University in 2000, really looks at this joint accountability, mutual accountability, both to the users of information and to the producers. So it's an organisation that sits between science decision makers in various ways and brokers and manages the long-term relationships between them. There's constitutional accountability both ways, and that enables the group to not be aligned in any particular direction, but in both directions. And it enables them to co-produce not only the information, but the values and the norms and the behaviours that occur within those groups, thereby reconciling supply and demand for information in that ongoing iterative way that I was talking about, and creating a safe space to move the conversation forward to do things differently. In that, it builds legitimacy for science. Much of our science is bits thrown at problems from various angles. This sort of process, and there are now quite a few boundary organisations around the world which are constituted in a statutory sense to have this role, and they become amazingly well-trusted institutions within a complex problem space like marine or coastal management. I don't have time to go into that, so the organisation focus encompasses all the other stuff that I've talked about. But it also has to have extraordinary leadership. It has to be able to coordinate, mediate, convene, and act as an honest broker. It really does have to act as an honest broker, and all its members do as well. It has to have that mutual accountability built in constitutionally and provide appropriate incentives for particular behaviours. these ones that are around honest brokering. It's very different from integrated RD&E. So, take-home message, the highlight, I think we really need to think more about these social and institutional aspects of the infrastructure that connect science to decision making in the context of specific sorts of problems. So we don't need to do all the bells and whistles all the time, but sometimes we do. The question is, which problems do we throw all the bells and whistles at? Because there are plenty of problems out there. And that's something that we can talk about later. The roles of actors are really important. We often think about this when we're designing our projects. We don't often enough think about how we can bring in external people who aren't scientists, who have other roles within society. We have an MOU arrangement in TIA, but enacting that needs to be a core part of project development. We need to use objects as we go and use them effectively, not just as outputs, because those objects build constituency support for our science, for what we do, and create new ways of thinking and talking. We need to consider the relationships we have as central to outcomes, and that's all the more so when issues are controversial. And we need to consider projects and programs as interventions in networks. We're part of networks, and we're an integral part of them. We need to take responsibility for some of those outcomes within networks through monitoring, evaluating, and intending to govern outcomes within those networks. And I think we have many, and particularly some very important long-term problems, and I think that there is space for small, well-organised boundary organisations to deal with some of those. But we want to do that very carefully. That's all I have, apart from a bunch of references, which at least, so I've been trying to